Hello, everybody who's online already. We're right at the hour. Um, and I see people are still signing on pretty rapidly. So let's just give it another minute to let some others join on to Zoom and we'll get started. Okay, let's begin. I'm your host and moderator, Roberto Suro. I'm now an emeritus professor at USC in journalism and public policy. Um, Before I joined the USC faculty in 2007, the one more relevant part of my background in this conversation was that I was the founding director of the Pew Hispanic Center and then a co-founder of the Pew Research Center and did a lot of survey work on Latinos in the aughts before coming to USC. So we've got a great panel of people here to talk about what happened to the Latino vote in 2024 and what do we know at this point now, some 5, almost 6 months out from the election. I'm going to introduce them briefly. Their full bios and a link to the survey report that I'll be mentioning in a bit will appear in chat. If not now, sometime soon. Anyway, starting from the top of the way I see them on my screen, we have Patrick Ruffini, a founding partner of Echelon Insights, a really interesting polling firm that very generously shares a lot of interesting information on social media, and also author of a book, Party of the People, that in some would say predicted some of the outcomes of the 2024 election. Mike Madrid, a political consultant here in California, author of the Latino Century, also another book that some people might say predicted some of what we're going to be talking about today in terms of Latino voters. Carlos Odio, co-founder and senior VP of research at Equis Labs, a polling, consulting, analytic firm that specializes in Latino voters and does some really important research. And finally, Jean Guerrero, who I'm happy to say, and maybe for the first time in front of a large public audience, will soon be the newest addition to the journalism faculty at USC as a tenured professor at Annenberg. So welcome. Also now contributing opinion writer at the New York Times and the author of a couple of important books, Crooks, a memoir, a biography of Stephen Miller, who keeps coming back as an influential character in our politics, and a longtime columnist before that at the LA Times and elsewhere. So welcome to the four of you. I'm going to steal the screen for a moment to share a couple of slides to tell you a bit about how we're going to proceed here and to get the conversation started. So as a starting point, we all know that polls and precinct data and a lot else indicates that Donald Trump did better with Latinos in 2024 than expected. And it's one of the major themes of the post-election analysis, trying to understand. Some people are focused on how much. Our interest is more in what happened and how and why. And so 4 big themes that have come up, among others, but 4 that we're going to talk about primarily today that have emerged in the post-election analysis. One, the predominance of inflation and immigration as preoccupations for all voters and preoccupations that contributed to Trump's success in particular. The other, a gender gap with Trump scoring better with males and females, and particularly notably among Latinos. By some measures, he did much better among Latino males than he had with Latino females in a way that advanced what has been a sort of an emerging pattern since his first presidential race in 2016. Another major theme involves low propensity voters, as they're known in the profession. People who vote in off-year elections, where Democrats, people who vote in general elections, but not in off-year elections. It's a way of explaining Trump's success, that he's done better with low propensity voters. The Democrats tended to stay home in 2024. There's lots of precinct data. Patrick has done all kinds of analysis showing all kinds of localities across the country where the Democratic vote was suppressed in 2024. And so there's this question of mobilization of people who are low propensity voters as an alternative strategy to mobilizing base. Anyway, it's one of the big themes. And then one of the questions that I think is worth raising is whether something specific happened to Latinos, because according to some ways of measuring the way the vote split, Trump improved himself with Latinos more than he did with non-Hispanic whites or African Americans or other racial ethnic groups. So is there something specific happening there? So these are four big questions, not the only questions, but a starting point. Through part of this discussion, I'm going to be referring to findings from a survey that we did here at Annenberg using a big panel study run by USC, the Understanding America study that's been used in political surveys in the last several cycles, excuse me, where we focused on Latino voters in particular. There's a link in the chat to this report. You'll see me throw up some slides with results that I'm going to use to provoke a conversation with our panelists with just a few of the findings. So first topic, asking Latino voters how they saw themselves as Latinos and raising the question of how is there a difference between Harris and Trump voters in that kind of identity politics, in the extent to which people's self-image as Latino affects the way they vote. So some results. First question, does what happens to US Latinos affect what happens in your life? Really clear difference here, where Harris voters and Trump voters came down on opposite sides of that question. Similarly, different question on a very important progressive talking point about the idea that people of color are natural allies. You can see that Trump and Harris voters split in sort of opposite ways. Interestingly, you only get a minority of Harris voters who agreed entirely with this proposition. And on immigration, which presumably is a unifying issue among Latinos, as we'll see more when we look at some of the immigration questions, a real split between the Trump and Harris voters on the basic question of whether you see immigrants as an economic benefit or as competition. One last point, the larger question of common fate. Do you think that I raised before, you can see there is a real partisan difference here. And interestingly, non-voters lean a little bit more in the direction of the way Harris voters saw this question. So, putting this broadly to the panel, are we seeing a significant partisan split on the question of group identity, of identity politics as a motivating force for voters? How do you read these results and what you've observed from the election?
I'm unmuted. I'll go ahead and start off.
Yeah, please.
I think, Dr. Suro, thank you first of all for having me. This is a great panel with some really brilliant minds, so it's great to be involved with this, and I appreciate the honor of being invited. The whole premise of the work that I put together in my book basically was an argument to suggest that Latinidad itself is changing and has been changing for some time and is about to hit a really fast point where that dramatic change is going to redefine this voters that we have commonly understood as a racially, ethnically driven and motivated and prioritized voter away from that and towards more economic pocketbook issues. I think properly understood, Latinos are the fastest growing segment of the blue collar working class, and they're behaving like non-Hispanic whites who they work with, play with, recreate with, trade with, and interact with on a daily basis. And again, they're beginning to take on those characteristics. I think it's really important to understand too that this is not a 2024 phenomenon, nor is it a 2020 phenomenon. The signs have been here for the better part of a decade. And I think that again, from my perspective, having worked on both sides of the aisle at very high levels of campaigns, my broad argument about why we're looking at and struggling to understand what's happening, or at least I think the Democrats are at this point in time, is the Democrats have a very specific lens through which they're viewing Latinidad, which is very stereotypically first generation, overly emphasizes racial and ethnic perspectives and prioritizes those issues. There's a heavy emphasis, I think, because of the academic influence in the Democratic base on things like gender, where Republicans dismiss all of that. I don't think either of them have a real good grasp that it can be both. And so where Republicans will overemphasize the economic issues or the working class issues as the main driver of what is occurring, and I think that's largely true, there is, I think, an underemphasis on both sides, or both of them are playing to their respective bases and trying to force Latinos into this understanding of their own orthodoxy. And I think on both sides, we're seeing a complete miscalculation. I shouldn't say complete, but at least a half miscalculation, where Latinos are really telling us it's not that race and ethnicity doesn't matter, but it doesn't matter as much as Democrats are saying it does, but it matters more than Republicans are saying it does. And as there's a really rapid increase in the number of second, third, and now a discernible fourth generation Latino cohort, which wasn't discernible in the 90s when you were working at Pew Hispanic Research and I was involved with a lot of this work back then, that Latinidad for fourth generation Latinos is far different than the recently naturalized first generation Latino. And that shouldn't surprise any of us. But what I think properly understood, what we're experiencing is a demographic transformation much more than a political moment. So I'll leave it at that.
I want to engage with that because I want to complicate that even a little bit more. Because I agree with a lot of what Mike said, but I like to disagree with Mike. So I'm going to lean into that for a second. I do think we see identities in conflict. I don't think it's as much about shifting identities as much as there are people who still hold an ethnic identity, but also have an identity as provider, protector, a more materialist consideration. And that those where once upon a time, maybe they pointed in the same direction, are now for a significant portion of Latinos pointing in different directions, and people are having to choose. And this particular election, you saw more of the materialist concerns win out, right? There still is a hold that ethnicity has over a significant portion of Latinos. And in fact, on 2 points on that, one, you showed all Trump voters versus all Harris voters, Roberto. But if you look at the Biden defectors, people who vote, Latinos who voted for Joe Biden in 2020, and then voted for Donald Trump in 2024. While all Latino Trump voters, only 36% in our polling have a sense of linked fate. Among those switchers, Biden defectors, a majority, 56%, still have a sense of linked fate, right? Big majority still say that being Latino is important to their identity. But they are putting that aside. You know, as a woman said in our focus groups after the election, a new Trump voter, but his very characteristic sentiment, she said, yeah, Trump is racist. I don't like that, but, and Trump is racist, but is a common sentiment among this group of voters. They see it, they don't necessarily like it, but they're voting on other considerations that they are prioritizing. The other piece I would add is, yes, generational change is very important, but as we consider the question, that's more than just an academic one of whether this is really a realignment or whether this is short-term forces. Realignments tend to happen over a longer period of time. Perhaps with our new media environment, maybe it accelerates. But the South went Republican over like a 50-year period, right? Like it was an extended, a protracted period. There are signs that you need to see. And one of them is not just changes in vote, but changes in party identification. And so far in the evidence that others, Bernard Fraga and Derek Wakefield at Emory have a working paper out looking at Latino party ID over a 36-year period, using a lot of polls actually that Dr. Suro did when he was at Pew, that now Mark Hugo does over there, and showing that actually if there is change, among US-born Latinos, it's less that there's more Republican identification and more less Democratic, that there's a de-alignment, that there's not the automatic identification with Democrat to the same extent among the US-born. Where there's shifting is among the foreign-born, that immigrants are becoming more Republican over time. And it's not just Cubans. The Cubans already kind of did their shifting. It is across the board, including among Mexican foreign-born immigrants. What we saw in our own polling, the biggest shifting toward Trump in this election was among immigrants. That's a different question to wrestle with because it isn't about assimilation exclusively. It is about cross pressures. And by the way, those cross pressures didn't disappear with Trump's gains. Those cross pressures still remain and are a source of uncertainty going forward as we try to predict what happens next.
I'll add to this that I think Hispanic or Latino identity exists in a pecking order, right? It's a question that we asked Texas Hispanics when we researched them all the way back in 2022 to understand the big shifts coming out of the 2020 election that continued into 2024. And when we asked people, what do you primarily identify as? Far and away, the number one answer was, I'm an American, 43%. Number two was, I'm a Texan, 23%. Number three was, I'm a Hispanic, at 21%, followed then by, I'm a Christian, 15%, and then by my ancestry, whether that's Mexican American or whatnot. So I think it's a very complex and multi-layered discussion here. Obviously directly bears on, and I know we'll get to this, but it directly bears on the issue of immigration and how that played out this year. And kind of the fundamental question is, Trump, in 2020, we had the sense, right, that there was a big Latino shift then. And we had the sense that, well, it was because immigration didn't matter as much as it did in 2016, that you had more of a focus on the pandemic, you had a focus on ending pandemic lockdowns, and Latinos really liked what Trump was doing on the economy. Well, in 2024, that was no longer the case. Immigration was, if anything, more central to the 2024 election result than it was to the 2016 election result. And again, yes, there has been, as Mike said, this theory, right, on the among the Democrats and on the left, particularly coming out of the Obama era, that you could solidify Latinos into something resembling a unified voting bloc for Democrats like African Americans were, and that completely went in the other direction over the course of the last two election cycles. But I think that the key factor here, right, is that that I think Latinos in the electorate this year did not necessarily view maybe the current wave of migrants coming over the border as the same kinds of people as them. And I think this is fundamentally different because the research we do, right, focuses on voters, right? The research I know that Roberto, you do, and you would do it at a place like Pew, is going to focus on all adults. These for Latinos are fundamentally different audiences, right? They're the audience of non-voters is significant, and those two groups are very different. But when we zoom in on voters are the only, those are the election results that we have to analyze. That is fundamentally different, at least in you have majorities of voters who are, let's say, second, third, fourth generation. So the frame, it is one where, automatically, right, if you are a voter, you are a U.S. citizen. If you are a first generation immigrant, you view yourself as a legal immigrant. So there were many strains, right, in this idea of that there is this pan-Hispanic or pan-ethnic group solidarity, right? And I think that was thrown into very sharp relief in this election cycle, in which, I think Latinos viewed the issue of immigration and border security very similarly to other voters this year.
And I'll just add that I think Trump just did a much better job of understanding the differences that exist between Latino communities and exploiting them to drive people apart. And these are long-standing differences. I remember reporting under the Trump administration out of Tijuana, Mexico, about angry protests among locals who were upset about the Central Americans who were arriving. We know that there's a long history of anti-Indigenous racism and colorism in Latin America. So this is, an identification with whiteness and internalized colonialism among a portion of the Latino electorate that, is influencing this in part. But, when it comes to the question of Latino identity, I was really intrigued by these findings in the survey about how 64% of those who voted for Trump said that what happens to the Latino population affects them not much or not at all. I think there is a lack of Latino consciousness among a growing portion of the Latino electorate, as some of the other speakers have pointed out. And I think this points to the limits of Latinidad as a unifying concept, particularly the way that the Democrats approach Latinidad, which is as this, oversimplified, reductionistic, monolithic caricature of what Latinidad really is.
Great, thank you. Let me just jump in on two technical notes. One, you can call me a lot of things, but don't call me a doctor. The second is the survey the results that I've been sort of flashing up here and will again are just eligible voters. So Patrick is absolutely right. The Latino adult population as a whole, when you include non-citizens, looks very different. And specifically, these are, and some of the results will differentiate people who actually reported voting and those who didn't. But when it says Trump and Harris voters, these are people who actually said, I voted and this is who I voted for in a post-election survey. I want to go back to immigration for just a second to make a point and then move you on to gender as our sort of next shared topic. So something I would point out is that it's always dangerous to talk about Latino voters as a whole. And what I believe we're seeing is polarization, and certainly there are shifts, but there remain substantial numbers of Latino voters who adhere to the old what was the conventional wisdom that generous immigration policies defined a certain Latino point of view. So this is responses to a question that offered people 8 different policy priorities, and they were to pick 2 that they considered most important. You can see that Harris voters in a near majority on the question of Dreamers in the upper left-hand corner, and then over in the right column, a broader legalization program. You get very large numbers of Harris voters who said that legalization in different forms were their priorities. And that was the conventional wisdom, that legalization was the motivating issue for Democratic-leaning Latino voters. And you can see the Trump voters very much focused on the removal of criminals, but also about a third of Harris voters also identify the removal of criminals as an important priority. I would note that is very clearly a response to effective framing on the part of the Trump campaign that put immigration, and continues to do so, entirely in this frame of criminality. And just one more data point on immigration. So this was a question that forced a choice between a very Trump-like statement and a quasi, what you would figure sort of progressive statement. Going to the question of whether there's a shift in the way Latinos think about immigration, 53% of Harris voters and 56% of non-voters agreed with this very harsh statement, that with so many people coming across the border in recent years, we have to get much more selective, even if that means detaining thousands and sending them back to their countries of origin. So this, I think, may be a measure of how views are evolving with the times. Immigration, the nature of the actual phenomena today, is very different than it was in 2012 when the post-election, the Republican autopsy and many other post-election analyses said that Latinos wanted generous immigration policies, and that explained their vote for Obama's reelection. So some of it reflects circumstances. A, Trump's campaign hammering at criminality, and B, the change of the phenomena on the border to this arrival of large number of asylum seekers, which is a very different phenomenon than what we were looking at in the late 90s and the aughts. All right, so on to gender, and particularly the interesting question of Latino males and Trump. So in looking at gender and partisan differences, one interesting phenomena we found is on questions like immigration and Latinidad, those questions we were looking at before, we had a partisan split, but not a gender split. Then on other questions, specifically those that went to like male roles and gender roles, and those that went specifically to Trump as a personality, we saw real gender differences with Trump males standing out, even from Harris males, and even from Trump women. So as we'll see on a whole series of gender role questions, Trump men are in a category of their own on this question of the charges against Trump. Again, Trump men unanimously, or 70% saying he was charged unfairly. Harris men almost unanimously saying it was fair. So you have a very clear partisan gender split. And here, a whole series of questions about male position in society. And in every case, you see Trump males out in a very specific position, all related to various ways of thinking about male roles in society. So the next topic to the panel, the question of gender among Latinos. And as I said, a lot of the polling indicates there was a real phenomena, the ballot box, with Trump, the Trump gains we've been talking about so far, more clearly concentrated among males than females. What do we think, panel? Who wants to start on this?
You threw a lot at us there, but I want to start by going back to the immigration point because it's
Sure.
absolutely so critical. I think it was always a mistake to think about the relationship between Latinos and immigration as one-dimensional. It was a mistake to ever think that immigration is the only thing Latinos care about, as much as it's a mistake to think that Latinos don't care about immigration somehow, or that most Latinos don't care about immigration, as much as it's a mistake to think that Latinos have gone anti-immigrant in some way. All of those are a very one-dimensional read, when it's actually a much more complicated thing. Latinos don't think of immigration as one thing. And it is not just a policy consideration, it is what the debate around it looks like. And so to drive home that point, I think there was a reaction to the influx that happened during the Biden years, starting in 2021. And I think a mistake that immigrant advocates made, and by the way, a mistake I made for not saying it more forcefully, was the extent to which Latinos, like all Americans, were uncomfortable, did not like, rejected the large numbers that they saw coming into the country and coming into the cities, and the sense that it was uncontrolled. It felt like chaos. Now, that, by not acknowledging that, I think it gave an impression of anti-immigrant sentiment larger than exists. I think that's at the surface. When you look underneath, a lot of the same attitudes that we've come to expect from the Latino electorate are still there. A lot of the people who rejected the people coming now are themselves immigrants, or themselves have undocumented family. What we saw was among the new Trump Latinos who voted for Trump in 24, but had not done so in 20, they did not think that Trump was going to broadly deport people. 60% of the new Trump Latinos said that they believed that Trump was only going to go after criminals and people who'd recently crossed the border. To only 26% who thought it was going to go broader. People who voted for Harris said, oh, no, he's going to deport everybody he can. People who voted for Trump said he's not going to do that. They did not think he would deport broadly, and they didn't want him to, right? There was support, and I think this is worth squaring. Some of the highest support we've seen remains for a pathway to citizenship. There still is this belief that we should take care of long-term immigrants. There is not support for deporting people who've been here a long time. We have a person who sticks with me as a 22-year-old Mexican-American from Georgia, who we talked to right after the election, whose both parents were undocumented, and he had voted for Donald Trump. And he said, because Donald Trump's not going to go after my parents. My parents are hardworking. They follow the law. He's going to go after the criminals. And by the way, my parents are going to be better off because Donald Trump's president, right? Because he's going to do more for the economy, because he's a businessman. So understanding it is a little bit more complicated than I think we let it out to be. And it is a mistake to narrow it to any one dimension, because the relationship remains complicated.
And can I just add to that? Yeah, I second everything Carlos just said. And I mean, there's the border issue, there's issues at the border and how people perceive those. And then there's interior enforcement, the question of the long time undocumented. And even in this survey, it showed that, most Latinos still prioritize legal status for the long time undocumented population with no criminal record. 54% of Harris voters said it was a priority, and 23% of Trump voters even said it was a priority. So on the immigration question, I think what we saw, was a lot of disillusionment stemming from the failure of a counter narrative by the Democrats on immigration as an economic issue, because economic issues were, at the forefront of everybody's minds. But the only candidate who framed immigration as an economic issue that affects the lives of Latinos was Trump, by saying that immigrants were going to be stealing Hispanic jobs. But in reality, immigration policy affects, the economic prospects of Latinos in so many ways. For decades, deportations have taken primary breadwinners from families, fracturing families and financially devastating them across the country. The failure to prioritize legalization for the long time undocumented has kept people working in the shadows and exploited for subpar wages, which has fueled economic inequality. And so I think the failure to talk about this when it was a signature issue by the Republicans on the Republican side, and the failure to talk about it by the Democrats was, kind of fueled a sense of disillusionment and disengagement among Latino voters. But I want to get back to the gender question that you asked, Roberto. So if anybody wants to jump in on that.
Let me just since I thought we were done with immigration, but we're not, so we'll continue on. And let me pose a question to Patrick and Mike, because I know you both have written about this in other ways. It's a question that's come from the audience, which is, how do you see generational differences on the question of the way how Latinos view immigration and even Latino identity? I mean, this is, we all puzzle over it. The question is the distance from the immigrant experience when you get to the second generation born in the US of immigrant parents and then beyond. And we're, because of the large number of people who came here in the 80s and 90s, we're seeing a very large number of their children, even now, as some of you mentioned, their grandchildren who are more distant from the immigrant experience as a larger part of the electorate. So how do you see that in particular playing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that of the voters in the electorate, of the people who are registered to vote, that it is very heavily weighted towards that second and third generation. Part of that is the fact that prior to 2020, we'd actually seen, numbers of border crossings and, immigration in general go down. There was more time to process, right? The average tenure, let's say, of a Latino in the United States went up. That coincided with rising economic fortunes, particularly during the first Trump administration, where I think it was something like, Latino incomes went up 22%. Now, maybe some of that was some of the pandemic stimulus that happened, but it was very clear in terms of economically. And I really think that this question of economic and upward mobility can't be separated from this intergenerational question. The sense of that, as Latinos are, staying longer or here longer in the United States as their second and third generation, their economic fortunes have gone up. When I was in South Texas doing research for my book, I could see this very clearly, where it seemed like there was this earlier era of voters where there was this all-pervasive sense that the Democrats were the party of the poor person in one of the poorest, if not the poorest region of the United States. And we needed to stick with the Democrats, right? To stand with those policies that would benefit people at the bottom of the economic ladder. You look in the 2010s, a lot of people got jobs in oil and gas. A lot of people, the children of those immigrants, right? There was a much different perspective on that in terms of upward mobility, at least in the 2020 data, right? It was both true, right, in our own research in the region, that the further away you get from that original immigrant experience, the more open people were voting, the more people were voting for Trump. That was true. As well as the way you move up, as well as moving up the economic ladder. So these are twin processes that are happening at once that I think was something that was a structural factor, right? Separate from the issues of 2020 and 2024, that over time has helped Republicans grow their share of the Latino vote. And again, independent of any of the issues of the campaign. Now, I think in 2024, I'd like to see more data on it. I think that probably flipped a little bit, where the first generation immigrants really caught up, right, to that. So I think that really flips the script, right? I mean, because there is this narrative that we want to say that, oh, the second, third generation immigrants want to shut the door on the first generation immigrants or something, or the people currently coming into the country or wanting to come into the country. When it's actually true that it seems likely that the biggest shifts specifically in 2024 were among people who had immigrated themselves.
Look, generational differences have almost always been one of the key demarcation points of politicization amongst Latinos. This is not new. This is like basic stuff. I was researching and studying in the early 90s. This is a lot of what you were finding, Mr. Suro. I didn't say doctor. Mr. Suro back at Pew Hispanic Research. That's when this is not new. It was peculiar in politics, especially during the Obama era, when we saw demographically the heights of the naturalized Latino citizen driving an immigration narrative, and the Democrats desperately looking for a racially polarized narrative. They needed to find an issue that would create essentially a permanent non-white voting bloc with Latinos where none ever existed. And I'm saying ever because what we're witnessing both before the 90s Great Migratory Wave began and the decline in 2007 was essentially a bubble that drove and fit the narrative of a lot of people who started to drive this racial ethnic identity narrative as central to Latinidad. It may have been for that bubble period of time. It is no longer the case. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that is not only no longer the case, it's becoming less and less so every year. And here is why. Yes, it is true, as Patrick and Carlos just pointed out, that the naturalized immigrant voter shifted considerably. David Shore's data at Blue Rose, good Democratic data scientist, was saying almost half of Hispanic immigrants shifted to vote for Donald Trump. That's also true of every immigrant group, by the way, in the entire country. It wasn't just Latinos, it was every immigrant group. So let's not set that standard and say this is a Latino thing or a Latino issue. More importantly, the naturalized Latino is only about 20% of the voter model. There aren't enough Latinos, Hispanic Latinos shifting that are naturalized to move the numbers that you're seeing nationally, especially when 80% of all these new Latinos are US born of further and further generations. So it's kind of, at a certain point, it's just kind of basic math. But let me tell you how significant the math is. In Los Angeles County, where I'm sure a lot of your listeners are tuning in, the largest Latino county by a wide metric, more Latinos in LA County than in most states. In 2002, the number of new Latino registrants that were foreign born was 54%, 2002. By 2022, that number was 8%. 8 in a 20-year period. The collapse of the naturalized immigrant Latino voter is redefining. Frankly, it's making a great argument because every year, as we become less and less a naturalized voter, it starts to explain why this anomalous bubble between the 90s and the early 2000s was so definitive in terms of what both parties, by the way, I'm going to say Democrats because they were the ones setting that narrative, but you brought up the autopsy in 2012. I was telling the RNC at the same time, you're thinking about Latinos totally wrong because you're assuming that the conventional wisdom that the Democrats are using was right, and they're totally wrong. And they were. And both parties are realizing that was wrong because it was assuming that Latinidad and ethnicity is static. And I can't think of any group that has any group that has an ethnicity that is less static than us. Like it's constantly in flux and transformation. It's part of being mestizo. That is who we are. And as we become more American, as Patrick pointed out, when this was by the way, when I realized the Trump people figured this stuff out and the Democrats had not. When you were seeing, the Harris campaign or the Biden campaign doing the Latinos con Biden and, doing the mariachi hats and going to the Mexican restaurant in Tucson, I was like, these guys just don't get it. They're speaking to a fast shrinking segment of our people. And at the same time, Donald Trump's big change was adding Americans from Latinos for Trump. In 2020, he adds emphasis, Latino Americans for Trump, which is where like 2/3 of Latinos primarily identify, which is what Patrick was saying anyways. There is an understanding of our culture, but the prioritization is not mariachi music. We don't all go to Mexican restaurants every day in Tucson and speak in Spanish. Most of us, by dramatic numbers, most of us do not. And the fact that we can have to
wait. I gotta push on a few of these things, Mike. First of all, Democrats did not create the narrative that we're talking about during Obama years. What happened is that you had the immigration fights of 2006, 2007, where the narrative that came from Republicans is you are not welcome in the Republican Party. Not just new undocumented immigrants, like immigrants and Hispanics are not welcome in the Republican Party. That was the message that came out of those debates. What happened is it did get transformed and misinterpreted as, well, Latino voters exclusively care about immigration policy and are going to vote based on a clear analysis of who pushed immigration reform this year or not. And part of what happened with Democrats is they didn't deliver on their promises. And so what came to happen by the later Trump years is that people believe there wasn't a big difference between the parties on immigration. That's what's happened. So just to be clear, differentiation on immigration remains important. That's one. Two,
30 years. That's incorrect.
Two, the change in the electorate is not third generation. What's happening now is that we're in a second generation moment. The children of immigrants and the children of immigrants actually care more about their Latino identity than their parents did.
No.
And so that's why it hasn't disappeared. So I want to make sure, because this materialist concern and the ethnic concern, the Democrats were focused too much on the ethnic that they missed the materialist. But a mistake would be to
If that were true, the simple math would say that
and
Harris
ignore
would
the
have won by a
ethnic groups.
landslide.
Once upon a time,
If that were even partially true, Harris would have won in a landslide because that's where all the growth is, Carlos.
on what?
That
On the
can't
second,
be true.
which part can't be true?
That the second generation is more emphasizing their Latinidad than the first generation.
They are. That isn't, but again, as I was saying earlier, they didn't necessarily all vote that way. So again, these things are in conflict, but the second generation in some ways has adopted this identity even more so because it's how you place yourself in American society. It's not just as an immigrant. It's like, where do I fit in? It's taking it as one of the badges that you wear. But the mistake, and Patrick was saying, is to think that Latinos only think of themselves Latino. They also think of themselves other things as well. But the second generation cares deeply. And that was the other thing. What we saw in this election, the biggest factor was vote switching. There were a lot of other things happening, but the thing that impacted and gave Trump his biggest gains was Biden voters switching over and voting for Trump, because vote switching matters more than churn, as far as, and especially did in this particular election. And so understanding that particular vote matters. And that part does show the dynamics that I was talking about here.
All right. I'll interject one historical note. The idea of naturalizing Latinos for political gain goes back to the Clinton administration, very forcefully articulated by Al Gore in the late 1990s, and with a big program to accelerate the naturalization of people who had become eligible for citizenship as a result of the '86 legalization. And it was Karl Rove in the very early aughts who imagined that if George W. Bush succeeded in enacting generous immigration policies, he could turn California purple. And based on the notion that and it was a Republican revolt, Tea Party people who later became what now are MAGA Republicans, that revolted against immigration, against what was the party's establishment position in favor of immigration reform as late as 2013. All right, so we've done with history. I still want to go back to gender, and we'll get to the question of the of low propensity voters that Carlos raised there at the end, because it's a really complicated, wonky, but very important issue. But I want to put back on the table what seems to be a fairly clear phenomena. One of the points that all of the polling seems to agree on, which is that Trump did way better among Latino males than he did among Latino females. And some additional polling with the numbers now that I put up a while ago, showing that you have very distinctive opinions on gender role questions, as well as on Trump himself as a candidate among Latino males. I'm curious whether in any of your research and reporting you've come across something similar, or if you have other explanations for what seems to be this gender divide among Latinos. Who wants to go first on this?
I can jump in. Yeah, I mean, it's clearly, so when I was looking at this survey, I thought it was really interesting that, but not surprising, that Trump voting Latino men were more likely than Harris voting Latino men to say that they carried a disproportionate burden to be financially successful compared to women, even though they face similar economic struggles. Trump voting Latino men as well as Harris voting Latino men report similar levels of economic struggles. But clearly, I think this is about male grievance for Latino men as well as for other male voters. I don't think there's anything unique about machismo or misogyny among Latino men. Mike mentioned mariachis earlier, and it made me think about the popular Mexican singer Vicente Fernandez's song El Rey, which, this author, Domingo Martinez, he describes it as the pain of machismo, the topographical map of the rural Mexican male's emotional processing. And the lyrics are also very much kind of a Trump monologue. He talks about how I do whatever I want and my word is the law. So if we're to see that as sort of a description of machismo among Latino men, I think it's very much also the essence of Trumpism and sexism in the United States. I think to the extent that there is a more pronounced shift among Latino men towards Trump, I think that's explained by the distrust in institutions and the establishment, which is another thing that stood out to me in this report. 2/3 of Latino men who supported Trump said they distrust the news media. 44% say they distrust scientists. And that distrust is definitely a reality for the Latino male Trump supporters who I've encountered in my reporting, in my own family. And I think that if I were to diagnose this distrust, I think in part it is a symptom of a weaker sense of community among men in general, and how that may be impacting Latino men specifically, because that lack of community, I think, makes Latino men more vulnerable to disinformation in online rabbit holes and these conspiracy theories that Trump provides, with easy explanations for what is going on that is wrong in their lives.
Gentlemen.
Well, I don't think that Democrats are going to get very far, right, by, say, belittling the Latino male voter, right, as potentially sexist, misogynistic, right? And I think that certainly was part of the narrative, right? That was certainly part of the discussion in 2024 around the media, right, that Trump tapped into, the manosphere, the podcast, right? So there was certainly that discussion, right? But when you're talking about an electorate that is certainly, at least going to be at least 45% male, right, within the Latino community, I think having a narrative go around, right, that is either primarily due to sexism or some other factor, right, isn't going to help Democrats or progressives in terms of winning back those voters. Now, certainly it wasn't the case, like, had Harris gone on Joe Rogan, would she have won? Probably not. But nonetheless, I think that has been an unfortunate addition to the narrative, but it wasn't exclusively, right? There certainly was a greater shift among Latino men, particularly younger Latino men, but there was a greater shift, I think, among African-American men too, right? I would even say the bigger gender divide in this election, right, is African-American men are over 20% for Trump, and African-American women are only 6 to 7%, right? So I don't think it's certainly something that is unique to Latino men, the shift that happened. I think it's been happening. It's happening among young men across the board. And it just so happened that younger voters in younger generations are going to be, more Latino, more diverse. And that's going to be the nexus of where it happens. But I think, the Latino shift was cross-cutting, more among men than among women, but also among women too.
That's right. And I think it's worth saying, I think it's right that young men ended up just looking more like other men who were non-Latino. I think that's right. I think in some ways it's actually more interesting, and we're looking at this now to study a certain subset of young Latina women, because like they're more different. The shifting was so cross-cut that looking at who the exceptions were to some of the shifting might end up being more interesting. But I will say, we sometimes oversimplify to say that so much of this is about the economy, and I think it's about the economy, but the economy is not just the economy. The economy is cultural. economy is about values. And when we look at the young men, Latino men, and how they're different from the young women, what sticks out is one, their assessments of Biden. They were just much more angry about Biden and didn't like Biden, and of Trump. So they like Trump more. Two, their media diet, right? So like the young men are more likely to do podcasts and Twitter and especially YouTube. YouTube is huge, and video games. But the third one is, Roberto, you talked about gendered roles, is a feeling. We tested this one value of a man's worth is his ability to provide and protect his family. That is one area where young Latino men jump out, even in difference to older Latino men. And there is just something about Trump and how he speaks to that particular feeling. There was a message that people got from him out of COVID, which is that he prioritizes the economy above literally everything else, including human life. But for young men who view like their worth in a similar fashion, which is like, yeah, that's what I should do. I should put protecting and providing for my family above every other consideration. They found in him a kinsman.
Thank you.
I think real quickly, there's one common thread line here that hasn't been mentioned, which to me is quite obvious, and that is Latinos and Latinas have the largest education gap of any race or ethnicity. And the non-college educated voter that is rapidly moving and consolidating under the Republican banner is disproportionately men in the Latino community. Our women are attending and graduating from college at rates far faster than our men, and that gap is larger than it is with any other race or ethnicity. So once again, like why can't we look at like some of the large overarching tectonic plate shifts that are happening and say, maybe it's happening to Latinos too, who are increasingly not viewing themselves all that differently, right? The argument that somehow there's this machismo, to me, that's just kind of this lazy ethnic trope where it's, we elect women at rates higher than any other race or ethnicity too. Broadly, in California, we've got more Latina legislators than Latino legislators, and that's not, Texas. It's not a blue state phenomenon. Florida's not that disparate. You also look at Texas is at like a 55-45 split, far outpacing white women and white men. So, and again, to take it back, and I hate using the Latin American analogies, but no place in the world has elected more women as heads of state than Latin America. Like this idea that cultural idea, that machismo is a cultural, a bad point for us, I think is again, I think it's incorrect, and I think it's just not a fair assessment of what's happening in the community at all. I'm not suggesting that there isn't a male female problem here, but as Gene said very correctly, you look at My Way with Frank Sinatra, that's the English corollary to Vicente. His El Rey, that exists broadly across cultures. And I'm not saying it doesn't need to be rectified, but I'm saying it's not unique to Latin American culture.
Right, so want to turn to one more subject, which has actually sort of come up already in some of the questions that we're getting from the audience. And it relates to one of the very distinctive characteristics of the Latino electorate, which has to do with turnout. So this is the results from the survey that I was mentioning that we've been showing results for, which shows that 40% of eligible voters did not vote. I actually think that could well be an underestimation. I mean, that would involve a 60% turnout, which would be quite high. The fact of the matter is, you go back 20 years, multiple elections, all kinds of different circumstances, all kinds of different outcomes. And what you see consistently, the one aspect of American politics that has not changed is that Latino turnout is 20% behind that of white non-Hispanic turnout. non-Hispanics have the highest rate of racial ethnic groups. Latinos consistently have the lowest. And it doesn't matter in high turnout elections, low turnout elections, the gap moves, and you've got this very significant non-participation, which results in this oddity that the plurality of the electorate are people who did not vote. And one of the big questions in the aftermath of 2024 is which of the parties, which of the candidates did better or worse in approaching mobilizing people who were on the margins, and had to be the first question was to get them to participate. And there are a number of questions from the audience already about what kind of narratives, what kind of communications channels, what kind of audiences are most likely to affect turnout. There's a question that some of us have been discussing amongst ourselves and is certainly part of the analysis of the election, is who would benefit if you increase turnout. Is this something that would Trump have done better with higher turnout, or would Harris have? So that's a boatload of topics that I know all of you have been thinking about. Pick your strand, and curious to hear your thoughts. Who wants to start? Carlos, I know you've done a lot of work on low propensity Latino voters, and try and translate that for a non-wonk audience, what your major findings have been.
Yeah, I mean, so much of we think somehow of turnout and vote choice as being kind of separate. You have a kind of voter who is persuadable and a kind of voter who is deciding whether to vote or not. It's actually the same in many cases, that it's a kind of voter who is deciding whether to vote before they're even deciding who to vote for, or in tandem, that those go hand in hand. So it is among a low propensity voter, by which I mean a voter who is less likely to vote, a more sporadic voter, among who Trump has made his greatest gains. That is his strength. I would say, like, we get a lot of questions about the abstainers, so the 2020 voters who sat out, and what that role was in this election. And that, again, tries to treat that as if those are governed by different forces. The reality is both the defectors, Biden defectors, meaning those who switched to Trump, and the Biden abstainers, those who switched to the couch, were in the same stream. They were floating down the same stream. It's just the abstainers kept going down the stream, and the defectors found another path that they found acceptable. Actually, a big differentiation is the abstainers didn't like Trump, and the defectors did. So if you thought Trump was a viable alternative, and you found it was socially acceptable to do so because more people in your social network were doing so, then that all of a sudden became another viable route. But they were all discontented in a very similar fashion. The people who sat out the election weren't largely a heavily progressive voter. They weren't to the left of Harris. Actually, we asked them, and 44% of them said that Harris was more liberal than them, to only 28% saying that she was close to their views, and something like 15% saying that she was more conservative. So again, it was the same forces that were moving both the people who switched sides and the people who sat out. We find that if everyone had voted, Trump would have done better among Latinos. If all Latinos had voted, Trump would have done better than he did. There were more pockets of Trump voters still even sitting out. I think that the question for those asking about what this means going forward, what to do about turnout, is to not think about it in terms of turnout. I think our message to Democrats is to get back to a persuasion mindset. This is about convincing people that you are on their side. And for Republicans who want to consolidate this, who want to keep the realignment going, similarly, it is about continuing in a persuasion mindset and not creating this false division between turnout and persuasion. If you could persuade enough people to vote for you, they're also going to be more excited to vote for you. To vote, period, I should say.
Yeah, I think your own survey showed, right, that the majority of all the the folks who among the non-voters who voted in 2020 voted for Joe Biden by 4 or 5 to 1, but they were dwarfed by the long-term abstainers, right? People who didn't vote at all in 2020 would be very hard to convince, right, to get off the couch, right, if they weren't going to do so already in 2020. But that doesn't mean that I think that data point does not at all mean that there was a Democratic abstainer advantage. I think a disproportionate part of those Biden voting abstainers probably would have voted for Trump. And the fact that they weren't inspired to vote for Harris shows their dissatisfaction, right? So Carlos is absolutely correct that vote choice and turnout are inextricably linked, and they move in the same direction, right? If you have a big shift persuasion-wise towards one side or the other, that also means that turnout, right? Turnout patterns are also going to benefit that side, because you're simultaneously persuading people, A, to come out and vote, and B, to vote for you. It all goes in the same direction.
So I conducted a series of polls throughout the Southwest, post-election polls of Latinos, to kind of ask this question and figure out and really dig deep into the difference between those that voted in 2020 and dropped off and those that continued to vote in 2024. I think the biggest, most striking finding to me was the fact that still a majority of Latinos, 54%, were saying that the Democratic Party best reflects their values and most importantly, understands them. But when we asked, do you think that if electing them would increase your personal situation in life, the numbers collapsed in a way, like 18%. Like the Democrats have a very, very significant believability problem now with what used to be a base voter for them. The way I try to analogize it is this. Imagine you've been in a relationship with somebody for 30 years, and you've been telling them, I hear you, I know what you want, I understand your needs, I get you, I feel you, I'm with you, and every time you come back, nothing has changed. At a certain point, and this is, I think, where we're at, Latinos have just said, ya basta, enough. Like, well, I'm done here. I'm done. And I think this is actually more damaging to Democrats' prospects than a simple vote swing. Is because a vote swing suggests that these voters are still in play. They're still engaged. Now they're just like, I just don't believe you at all anymore. I'm done. And let's also keep in mind, this has been a persistent problem for 30 years, probably longer, but there's good data for going back for 30 years in terms of turnout. There is no community that is comparable, there are Black churches and there are Black leaders been involved with those efforts. There's a little bit with the API community, but overwhelmingly there's a whole infrastructure of Latino nonprofits and advocacy groups who keep saying, if you just invest earlier and more money, give me more money, we'll solve the turnout problem. And you know what? They've never solved the turnout problem. Because at some point, it doesn't have anything to do with infrastructure. It has everything to do with message and believability and relatability. And maybe rarely, have I ever been in a focus group of Latino voters where people will say, we talk about the Democratic Party, who will say, oh, they're the ones that focus on the economy. They're the best ones for the economy. Despite 30 years of data saying the economy is by far our #1 priority. Talk about immigration, they're there. But again, that's not the way Latino voters broadly are prioritizing and motivating and politicizing to actually show up and go to the polls. So it was a problem in 2024 come home, but this has been a long-term, generational, persistent problem that needs to be reconciled and rectified.
And when it comes to believability, I do think immigration is a part of it because, Biden ran in 2020 on this promise to legalize the long time undocumented population it didn't happen. Some Latino voters see it as a broken promise, like other voters. And Stephen Miller and Donald Trump have been able to successfully paint Democrats as elites who are pro-immigrant only because they want cheap labor, because they have not prioritized this as an issue. They have not prioritized the liberation of the longtime undocumented population. They talk about it, but they never walk the walk. So I think that has to be a part of the solution as well, is turning that into a priority because of the economic implications. And I'm talking about internally, dealing with the longtime undocumented population.
Let me, we're close to time, but I want to share one point that underscores some of what we've been has come up in this conversation recently. So we looked, the panel survey that we were using asked a lot of questions about economic well-being, both experiences of it and feelings towards it. We looked back a year or more into people's histories to look for there was a differentiation between Trump and Harris voters in the way they had experienced inflation and the economy going back into 2023. The result over and over again was that everybody experienced the economy in a similar way. So it was really a difference, not in experience, but in the way it was processed politically, in the way people reacted to the messages they were getting from the candidates and the parties, because they all started from a similar starting point. There's actually more of a gap in attitudes towards the economy between white and Harris and Trump voters. Non-Hispanic whites, you saw a real difference with Trump voters reporting more ill feeling. Among Latinos, it looked like, as I said, everybody sort of experienced the same thing, but ended up voting differently in their responses. And the other point that I would make is in terms of the non-voters. Let me pop this up again because it's easier to see. So these are 2020 non-voters. About 3/4 of them had not voted in 2020. These are long-standing people who don't vote. And you can go back to 2016, you find that there's this large share of the Latino electorate, 2/3 to 3/4, who just don't vote. But among those 2024 non-voters, 21% of them had been Biden voters the last time around, and they sat it out. That to me is a really significant loss, much greater than the Trump erosion. And this, there's no easy way to answer this question of who got hurt most by abstention. But there seems to be a lot of evidence. Patrick, you've done precinct level studies that show, this erosion of Biden voters who didn't switch but abstained. And it seems to me that that was a large phenomena among Latinos. If somebody has like a 20-second finale here, rebuttal, jump in.
I would say like the precinct analysis, what it shows. I mean, I think that New York Times has tried to do this, particularly in places like New York City, showing a decline in the number of votes, right, received from Biden to Harris. But I think the fundamental reality is you're looking at precinct shifts of 20 points in places like the South Bronx. Go to places like Paterson, New Jersey, 39 points. There is no way you can explain that via abstention, right? And it's just easier for vote switching to move precincts like that and to move individual voters, because for every for every voter that, was going to vote Democrat, you're now adding one to the Republican column. So it just automatic, a lack of mobilization. It's just harder, right, for it to significantly move the number. Not to say that there was any, but again, I think it moves hand in hand. And I think normal conventional wisdom, it would be that, vote switching is doing about 2/3 or 3/4 of the work in terms of the shifts we see from election to election.
Great. Patrick, you get the last word. I want to thank you all panelists for joining this conversation today, and also special thanks to the staff at the Annenberg Center for Communication and Policy Leadership, which helped put on this show and helped me in producing this study. And so thank you all, and thank you to the audience for tuning in. We'll do this again. Thank you, and so long.